Hello, welcome to the finishing of our t-shirt quilts, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the quilting and the binding process to get the quilt completed. And here I have my quilt loaded on the long arm, and I have loaded it where the top of the quilt is actually going to be along the side edges there that you're looking at, and then that way I am just doing squiggle lines from the top to the bottom of the quilt, so they're going vertically, but the way that I have it loaded, I can just run them horizontally back and forth, and then when I take the quilt off the quilt frame, it is the right direction where it's going top to bottom. So it just gives me a long, easy pass to just do squiggle lines. They're totally random. They're randomly spaced apart. Some are deeper valleys, and then some are just real shallow lines. But this makes just for a nice quilting all over the whole entire quilt without putting a ton of effort or fancy designs, because this is a quilt that is going to be washed and used, and it just needs to be, utility stitching so that it can be a quilt that's going to get some use. So I'm just going to go ahead and finish quilting. Okay, let's get started by sewing some binding strips, and I've just cut like 4 or 5 strips from the leftover backing, and I'm just going to use that as my binding. Let's see, and so first we're going to do then is to join those binding strips. So I'm going to place them right sides together And I'm just going to offset a little bit because then I can see where my start and stop is, and I'm not going to then draw a line. I'll just sew a diagonal line from corner to corner. Okay, and then I'm just going to pick up the end of that strip that I just added, and I'm going to add the next one to it. Doing the same thing, kind of right sides together, and then we'll just sew corner to corner. Okay, and then I'm gonna cut all those apart. And then I'm gonna trim a 1/4 inch away, just eyeballing it from the seam that I just stitched. And then when we open it up, we have a diagonal join, and then we can just go ahead and I'm gonna press those flat and then fold everything in half so that I have my binding strip ready to go. Okay, I got my binding strips here just kind of piled up, and my starching method for this, just because I don't want to starch all along every strip, is I just kind of do a few squirts onto the pile, move it around, and that's good. That'll just give it a little bit of stabilization kind of as I go, and then it just keeps it from just, you know, stretching all out of whack. I'm just going to continue pressing, just folding it in half so that my edges are meeting here, and then I just press that down. And I'm coming to a join, so I'm going to just give it a press to one side just so it lays a little bit flatter as I press it in half. Okay, and then I'm just moving my pile from here to here. Okay, to attach the binding, I have the wrong side of the quilt facing up. I am going to attach my binding to the wrong side, roll it around to the front, and then stitch it from the front with my machine just right along the edge of the binding. So that's how I do my binding, but if you like to hand stitch, you can still attach it by machine. You would just want to attach it to the front, wrap it to the back, and then hand stitch it down on the back side. But this is the method I prefer. So I'm going to leave a tail about 10, 12 inches long, and then I'm just going to start sewing, and I'm close to a corner, but not necessarily in the center or anything like that where I'm starting it. I just picked a point to put it down, and then just knowing that I'm coming to a corner pretty quick, and then I can just keep adjusting my weight of the quilt that's hanging over here. And I'm offsetting it, my edge of my binding, I'm leaving about a 1/16 of an inch of the backing of my quilt showing. So I'm not exactly to the edge, I just pull it over just a tad so that I can see the back of my quilt, just making sure that I have it within my seam allowance and I've caught everything evenly. So, and then I'm just stitching a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the binding. I have a mark on my presser foot there. I am using a walking foot. I find it easier to attach that way. And just go slow, keep readjusting as needed. Okay, and I'm getting close to my corner, and so what I'm going to do is just line my binding piece up. I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch of the way until I get to the end of the quilt. So I'm stopping a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the quilt here, and then I'm just going to veer off and stitch a 45-degree angle right into that corner. Pull that out, cut my threads, and then to go down the next side, I am going to take my binding and I just keep the tail of it thrown down, a pile down at my feet. I find that that works okay with me. Some people prefer to roll it up and have it somewhere handy here, but this is fine for me. So I'm just going to pull this back so that I now have a straight line from the back of my quilt to the binding strip. It's going in a straight line, and that made a 45-degree angle fold right there. And so I'm just going to kind of hang on to that and then fold my binding over towards the edge of the quilt, and then that makes my mitered seam. And then I'm ready to just start stitching at the edge. And I'm just going to kind of hold that in place and turn it just a little bit here. Okay, and then I'm just going to start stitching at the edge of the quilt. Right straight down this other side, the next side for the binding. Okay, and then as I go, I'll just readjust the excess quilt here. I just have it piled up so that I can kind of keep it on my table. It helps to keep the drag away a little bit. And then we'll just continue around until all the binding is attached to the back side of the quilt. Okay, I have stitched the binding on, and I have left an opening between the two edges approximately 10 inches long. And then what I'm going to do is take the binding and I'm going to kind of fold it so it's kind of in the center of that 10 inches. And I am going to just lay it flat, and then I want a 1/4 inch space between the two ends of the binding when I fold them back. So I'm folding it back so that on each side so that there's a 1/4 inch gap in there. And then I'm just going to take my fold and really press it really, really good because I want that to be a strong crease in there.
And this is probably harder to see just because the backing is the same as my binding strips. So we'll just see if we can tell anything. So then I open it up and I've got a strong crease there. And I'm going to grab a clip. I got a couple small binder clips here. We'll see if that works to just kind of fold the quilt out of the way a little bit. Okay, all right, so then I take this end and I've got that strong crease. I'm gonna open it up and I can see the crease lines there. And then I'm gonna take this one and line up the line this way, and then I'm going to open it up and my folds in the center will also meet. So the folded lines then are meeting vertically and diagonally. And then I am going to pin that into place here and here, and then I can stitch right along there so that it's actually, I'm stitching the seam parallel to my quilt edge. Okay, so I'm gonna pop a pin in there. And there's so many different ways you can join your binding. This way just seems to work for me. Okay, now I've stitched that binding together right there at a seam that is parallel to the back of my quilt. And I'm going to take the pin out and I'm going to check it first before I trim off the excess, just to make sure that I got the angle correctly. And I'm going to unpin that, and then it should just lay flat right next to my quilt top, and it does. So we can go ahead now, and I'm going to pop that open again. And I'm going to trim that 1/4 inch away from that seam. Okay. And then I am going to just flatten it down, and I can press that seam, but it's going to be real nice and smooth there. It finishes flat against there. So I can just go ahead and stitch that little section on there. And then I'm going to come back through, and with my iron, I'm on the back side of my quilt. I'm just going to give it a really good press to get my binding. I'm going to pull it away and open up that seam there, or pull it away from the quilt back and press it. That will just keep it so that I can turn it a little bit easier. I won't be fighting with it quite as much, so that I can wrap it to the front, and then at my machine I'm just going to go ahead and top stitch it down, and then we'll be done. Okay, I have my quilt under my needle, and I am now working with the quilt right side facing up, and I am just folding that binding over that seam, and I'm making sure that it's going to cross over the stitch line where I attached it on the back. And then if I cross that over there, then I know it's covering it. And when I stitch right along the very edge of this fold on the binding, when I flip it over, I'm going to have a stitch that is outside of my binding, so I'm not stitching through all the bulk. I want it to be on the quilt, and I'm okay with the line being there. It's just easier to stitch without having to stitch like exactly lining up that edge where my seam would fall right along the groove, because it will inevitably jump up and then you're stitching on the binding and then it comes down. So this way I'm okay with it just looking good from the top. So, all right, I'll go ahead and put that in there, and I am going to back stitch a little bit, and I'm just stitching like a 1/16 inch away from that fold. And then when I get to the corner, I'm going to fold this edge back on itself and then tuck that into the corner there and bring that corner down, and I should have a really nice little miter there in the corner. So then I can just stitch that. I stitch right to the edge of that folded corner, and then I am going to turn my machine and stitch into the corner about 3 or 4 stitches. And that's just going to hold that miter nicely in place. I make sure that I caught all the edges in there. And then I just turn it and come down the next side. And I'm just going to continue around the whole quilt doing, just pulling it over and stitching it down. Okay, and I should have enough here that I can pull over, and you can see, well, it's really hard to see, that white thread blends right in with that fabric, but my stitches are just right along that very edge of the fold on the binding side, and I've stitched into the corner right there, and then on the back side, that stitching line just falls, it's about 1/8 of an inch away. Again, I'm just using a coordinating thread, and so it's not super, noticeable on the back side, but I'm okay with that because I want it to look good from the front. So I'm going to go ahead and just keep stitching.